which suggested they were greater than others, CEOs who think that for the rest of their lives they need to fly on private corporate aircraft because they shouldn't travel on commercial aircraft, people who were paid far more than they were worth, people who lost the authenticity of their humanity because they had sufficient wealth surrounding them that they could pretend to be what they were not, greater than their fellow man. And we have paid a huge price in our society for that kind of arrogant greed. Lack of authenticity is what I would refer to it as. Another aspect of the 21st century leader from a personal and human standpoint is the mental model that one takes to work every day. Is the mental model framed solely by the parameters of a single country, a single culture, a single monolithic, a single religious, or a single experience, set of experiences in growing up? Or is that mental model shaped by a recognition, an awareness, and a knowledge, a working knowledge, of other mental models that are out there? Jeff mentioned the infotainment speakers. And to hear some of those infotainment speakers speak to other religions is frankly an embarrassment in our country. When religions have their own diversity, their own beauty, their own belief system, their own sanctity, who is one of them to criticize, as is the case so often in this country, a Muslim religion as being somehow a different or a religion that fosters violence, when we know that is not true? And so the ability for mental models to coexist in one's own mind, to acknowledge the benefit of one type of art or another type of art, one type of music, another type of music, one type of belief system or another. These are all important aspects in the world of mental models. And it is the ability to balance and manage multiple mental models that is critical for 21st century leadership. Let me come down to the most basic of all, and that is the integrity that a leader brings to what it is that he or she leads. The integrity of person, the integrity of values, the integrity of mental models that work, the integrity of one's own authenticity. These personal qualities, ladies and gentlemen, are essential for 21st century leaders, and they were missing too often, so often, in 20th century leaders. Let me close on a final note. The fourth area that distinguishes the 21st century from any previous century in the leadership model of the future is the ability to lead sustainability and social responsibility simultaneously with everything else that must be led. We have but one world. We have but one atmosphere. We have but one body of water connected to many different parts of the world called our ocean. We use plural, but it's all interconnected. The atmosphere is interconnected. The human race is interconnected. The sustainability of this earth and the peoples on it has never been more at risk in the view of tens of thousands of experts who study this. And the social responsibility associated with sustainability uniquely defines the 21st century. There is no question but what the abuse of this earth in the 20th century is and was not sustainable. As a senator and I discussed the disappearing wetlands in Louisiana to Senator Landrieu, what we knew in the 1950s and the 1960s about the interaction of the wetlands and the sea was a lot less than we know now. And the regulations that exist today in that energy patch are such that there can be a compatible coexistence of development and the wetlands. But what was done in practice in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s have led, unfortunately, although the regulations were followed, to a very high-risk situation of perhaps permanent loss of wetlands. We didn't know what we didn't know at the time. We know it now. In the future, the lesson learned is how do we anticipate what it takes to both have a growing and successful economic well-being of the world, and at the same time manage and caretake the earth on which we live and the peoples with whom we share this earth. So sustainability and social responsibility in material, manageable ways will define the 21st century leader unlike any other time in the past. And when decisions are made to go to war, and when decisions are made to invest by corporations, and when decisions are made by county governments or city governments, those decisions made by those leaders, and we, the people who put them in office, must take into account the social and the environmental consequences of whatever decisions those leaders make. We screwed it up in the last century, sometimes not knowingly. Sometimes we probably did know. But the 21st century cannot afford a repeat of the 20th century if we can achieve what the Gulen Institute stands for, and that is the highest human values. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the very informative and excellent speech, Mr. Hofmeister. We may receive a couple of questions. We have still time. I would like to ask, you have talked about different aspects of the leadership and an example leader. I would like to ask if, I'm sure you are very experienced, have you ever observed or is there any case that those aspects have a conflict? Or how can a leader act in a case of conflict of those aspects? Or they're all consistent?
I think the consistent question is the operative word. A leader is, first and foremost, a human being. Human beings are known to fail. I think when a leader fails, it's critically important to acknowledge the failure. And I think that there have been many corporate leaders who I'm more familiar with than political leaders who refuse to acknowledge their failure. What we are in today is the consequence of people failing to take risk management decisions seriously. Making money off of money is always a risky business, and that's what we were doing for years. Making money off of making something, that is something substantial. Making money off of a real service, where a person delivers a service. So making money and creating value from making something or serving somebody is one way of making money, but when you're making money off of somebody else's money, such as packaging credit default swaps off of mortgage instruments, which are all an abstraction. So you're taking risks of asking investors to pay for an abstraction on top of an abstraction for which nobody knows the counterparties. That's high risk. And so for these corporate leaders, whether it's Citigroup or whether it's Lehman Brothers or whether it's Morgan Stanley, whoever it is, and to be so highly paid for taking risk with other people's money, and then not to admit they were wrong, and not to capture that before it became a crisis. That's a serious deficit of leadership. And people were just fundamentally dishonest with themselves, with their investors, and unfortunately with the society, which now suffers because of their poor leadership. And I don't mind calling it poor leadership. I was on CNBC the day after Lehman Brothers collapsed, and I was asked by, I think it was Carl Quintanilla, so what do you think of the Lehman collapse? And I said, what does the business community think of the Lehman collapse? And my response was, well, the way they spun risk out of control and failed as human beings to manage that risk, there is no sympathy that I know among the business community for these leaders that just took risk with other people's money and made a fortune while doing it. So they deserve what they get. I said it's a pity that the employees suffer from that poor quality of leadership. And it's a pity that the society suffers. So the ability to do wrong, we all do wrong, but to acknowledge it and then to correct it. That's the big difference. Any other questions?